Hey guys, welcome to The Disruptors, the podcast where we get the folks that are thinking about and transforming the future. Today, we've definitely got one of them, Alex Ross. Alex, thanks for coming today. Is
No
it
problem.
Alex
Hey,
or
can I
Alec?
actually? Yeah, it's Alec actually with a C.
Yeah, my pronunciation's terrible. I know it's Alec with a C, but I'm not so great at this apparently. So
That's
I
all right.
want to, yeah, thanks for coming on. Yeah, you seem like a super interesting guy. You've been involved in government and nonprofit. You've been involved in just about everything. I wanted to start with the innovation hubs. I hear you traveled the world. You helped Hillary quite a bit in her Secretary of State role, and your job was innovation. What exactly did you do?
Yeah. So look, I was the person in the Obama administration whose job it was essentially to lead a team to figure out how to maximize the potential of technology to address foreign policy problems. So that's everything from wiping out GPS in Syria so the Syrian intelligence service can't locate people through the GPS on their cell phones and assassinate them, to putting an anonymized encrypted text messaging program in place in cartel controlled cities in northern Mexico so people could safely report crime and cartel activity, to restoring communications in rebel held territory in Libya during the revolution. Basically, I operated in this world that was not entirely white and overt or black and covert, but worked with a team from across government, basically with some technology skills to try to advance America's foreign policy interests.
So you were a spy and a super genius. You were M, essentially.
No, I did not work in the covert world.
It sounds
I'm
super
able to I'm
exciting.
able to talk on a podcast about what I
Yeah,
do.
they're not going to come and grab you, I hope. But if they do, this will be great footage.
There you go.
How did you get into government? How did you get into politics, innovation? What's your background?
Yeah, so I got into government politics through the first Obama campaign. I ran tech policy for Barack Obama's first presidential campaign. But before that, I was an entrepreneur. It's sort of the classic American entrepreneurship story. I started a tech focused company in a basement with three friends, long time ago. It was the right idea at the right time. It became, somewhat successful. And it was through that, we actually did some work in Chicago that I got to know a really smart state senator. And when he ran for United States Senate, I helped him. And when that United States senator ran for president, I helped him. And so I sort of got into politics and government specifically because of Barack Obama.
Did you find it a little bit weird or uncomfortable? You're the entrepreneur. You're kind of the anti-government guy, I would imagine. At least that's what it feels like from the business side. Did it feel weird to switch?
Well, not entirely. I mean, the first thing is that the caricature of government as being innovation adverse is not entirely true. I mean, that may be the case in many respects, but when you're, engaging with people at the White House and in the senior most levels of government, I mean, with all due respect to, the app makers of the world, there's a whole lot of game there. Just read what was actually leaked by Edward Snowden. The capabilities in the senior most parts of government, there's some it's pretty substantial. And, we were able to, I guess, because I wasn't sort of a mid-level bureaucrat, I had the authority and the ability to be able to make things happen that oftentimes aren't able to happen in government.
How'd you make things happen?
Part of it is by having support from the top. So whether it was the president or whether it was the Secretary of State, whether it was the military, I mean, when it's time to wipe out GPS in Syria to stop assassinations, if you have the top cover from a president of the United States or a Secretary of State or a CIA director, you can then move this big engine of government. But you have to have your hands on the lever and the will and ability to then use it. So that is sort of the top down approach. The bottom up approach was, there were a lot of people in government under the age of 35 who didn't want to go into middle age as sort of, white shirt, red tie bureaucrats. And, it's sort of, they loved the innovation agenda. So it gave us this little army of younger diplomats, younger people, younger defense officials, younger White House officials who were willing to make mistakes of commission rather than omission and really figure out how to use technology.
Do you think that's still happening today, or does it feel like we've gone backwards? It's hard to tell from the outside.
I think it's pretty clear that we've gone backwards. There's maybe a smart technology person or two or three in the Trump administration, but it's pretty regressive. I mean, everything from, we're going to open the coal mines again, to, sort of 19th century anti-immigrant, neo-mercantilist economic policy. I mean, when Donald Trump says we're going to make America great again, there's actually some political economic theory behind that. It's a concept called palingenesis. It's the evocation of a utopian past that may or may not have existed before. It's kind of like, when Mussolini, whose fascism is similar to Trump's, would say, we're going to restore the greatness of Rome. Or Hitler, another person whose politics are closer to Trump's than, they are to Obama's, would say, the Germans will rise again. This assertion of a utopian past that may or may not have existed before has deep roots in sort of political ideology, and it is by its nature regressive. It's not future looking.
And it's easy to forget the negatives of the past because you only remember the positives. They're much larger on the sum, so to speak. But if you have a shorter term time horizon, the news is always negative. It's why you don't really want to watch the news. But if you could watch the 100-year news, everything would be freaking great. How do we
it is kind of funny when you think about that. I mean, goodness, I'm not that old. I'm 46 years old, but the day I was born, global life expectancy was 58. Today, it's over 70. So the other thing is that, when you do evoke this glory of years past, you're evoking a period of substantially shorter lives. At 46, you would have been entering old age. Today, lots of us are, refusing to even call ourselves middle-aged. The 46-year-olds of today act like the 36-year-olds of 5 years ago, and the 26-year-olds of 30 years ago. So it is the relativism in how we assess a period of time is pretty remarkable.
How do we change that on a policy perspective? We all know that Social Security is screwed.
Right. That's a good question. I think that, look, all of these technology changes contribute to the promise and peril of what's happening to us. But I do think that we are sort of awash in bad news right now, and we do have to point to the positive. For example, again, during what I think is a short life, global life expectancy has gone from the 50s to the 70s. That's a great story. So, but in addition to telling great stories, I think what we need to do is we need to make sure that, those segments of society that have struggled in the last few decades understand why they're struggling. And, it's not just, technology isn't blamed, or, those Silicon Valley guys aren't blamed. There's a lot more complexity to it than that.
How do we do that? Because there's been such an anti-science movement between that and anti-fact. It's problematic to say the least.
It's enormously problematic. God, I wish I had an answer to that. I'm chock-a-block full of opinions, but if I thought I did know the answer to that, it's probably what I'd spend 16, 17 hours a day doing. I'm not curled into the fetal position. I'm not saying that there isn't a road forward, but every time somebody tries to do something, create more curated news spaces, trying to create, programs or products that burst filter bubbles, they don't really break through. So right now, I think things are trending in all of the wrong directions.
And it's because of it's evolutionary. We're designed to have 150 people in our circle. We're designed to trust them over others because that allows us to survive and have easier processing power, so we can go and find food and make babies. It's a problem. Humanity's past the point of our evolutionary means at this point.
Well, look, that's a better explanation than I could have otherwise offered, because most of the other explanations is that humans are basically herd animals, and if you feed the herd animals enough bad information and change their information environments, then they're easily manipulable. I used to think one of the single biggest mistakes I made, in any job anywhere, was my judgment probably 10 years ago that the internet made propaganda more difficult, because I thought that it would be easier to sort of name and shame manipulation and or to fact check. And even though it is easier to fact check than ever before, what it's also done essentially is give a framework for alternative facts. So boy, was I wrong.
What do you think about the dichotomy with the US system of more open internet versus the Chinese system of a more closed and centralized?
Well, look, not surprisingly, I have pretty strong views about this. I mean, my name was a banned search term on the internet in China when I was working for President Obama, specifically because one of the programs that I ran was our internet freedom agenda. Everything right down to the funding of Tor and other proxy and circumvention technologies, so that when people are in China, they can communicate with the outside world. So, look, I have a strong ideological view that the openness of our networks are at the core of why we have had so much innovation and wealth creation over the last quarter century. And closing those networks, censoring those networks, having centralized command and control of those networks is as authoritarian as, that's 21st century authoritarianism in my view.
It is, but let's play devil's advocate. Can it be a more effective system? I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I think a lot of the things that China is doing are terrible. I just see them kicking the US's butt when it comes to a lot of funding, innovation, growth, and future industries.
Yeah, so let's make a distinction between two things. One sort of centralized industrial policy and another, open or closed internet. Having Beijing instrument industrial policy in a way that does not happen in the United States lends itself to certain efficiencies. It makes it easy to commandeer an entire economy. Everything that happens in that country of 1.3 billion people flows from a strategy that Xi Jinping has architected in Beijing. That enables a level of coordination, discipline, and strategy that our messier, more decentralized America does not allow for. Here's the thing, though. I will trade our messier, less controlled environment over the more centralized command and control environment of the Chinese any day of the week. Even in fields like AI, where the Chinese have made remarkable gains because of the will that they have, I would take $100 million of American R&D in a more open environment over $500 million in the Chinese more closed R&D models any day.
Especially because there's no exits in China. It's very hard to actually get any money out once you do have any type of success. I think it's not something I believe, but it's something that's an interesting thing to bring up because not enough people really consider some of the parallels if you were to kind of invert the circle. And I think circles always go around.
No, I think you're right. And look, I do not have a utopian view of the American model and a dystopian view of the Chinese model. There are a lot of reasons why they've had levels of growth that we haven't had in recent years. One among them is their ability to do really strong industrial policy. But I'm struck by one thing. If you go to any naturalization ceremony in the U.S., one of those rooms where anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred people are becoming American citizens, you'll see among them a great many people from China. If you go to a naturalization ceremony in China, if you can find one, you sure as hell aren't going to find an American. There's still tons of Chinese who would love to be American, and you can't find a single American anywhere who wants to renounce his citizenship and become Chinese. And I think that flows directly from the relative openness of America and the American economic model contrasted with the more authoritarian model coming from Beijing.
I think that's a good point. I think other countries possibly, but China not so much. What was it like? What was it like when you met Obama? Talk about that.
Well, at first he was just a state senator, so I didn't think it was a big deal, and I thought far from it. I thought he was a very smart state senator. I was like, oh my goodness, this is not your typical locally elected official. And, my goodness, oh, look at this background. He was the editor of the Harvard Law Review. He does have some extra skills. As I got to know him, what I became most impressed by was his ability to move between two different worlds, the world of the South Side of Chicago, which he was then representing, and the world of geopolitical ideas. He could go from the 196 country chessboard to, the 15 wards he represented in the South Side of Chicago and connect the two in a way that I thought was incredibly rare. And that's why I chose to get involved from, the very beginning of his career as a national political figure, because there was this otherness. He had this sixth gear that others don't have.
Is that the big difference between Obama and other politicians? You look at politicians today, and you can comment or not comment, depending on what your future aspirations are. But a lot of them seem like complete scumbags. They seem completely disconnected from the people they represent, and they think primarily big picture, and a lot of times for themselves or their party above all else.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, if you take the 535 members of the United States Congress, inclusive of the Senate, those tend not to be my 535 favorite people in the world. Politics and government are incredibly important. And, I will spend my life moving between politics and government, entrepreneurship, academia. I think that it's a good idea to move between those worlds. But for those people who can't do anything other than run for office, and when they're in office, all they really give a shit about is accumulating more power and running for the next office, I hold those people in contempt. And it's part of why, even though I'm a Democrat and, work for Barack Obama, I'm oftentimes very critical of the Democratic Party because, I think the shortcomings in the Democratic Party are substantial. We don't have the sort of neo-fascism that we see in the Republican Party right now. But we do see, the leadership of the Democratic Party is chock-a-block full of career politicians who do not have the first clue about how the economy works.
And it's tough. Just looking at politics from the outside, it's very easy to become cynical. What does Silicon Valley, what do tech leaders need to do to try to better interface with government? It seems like in the past it was kind of, yeah, we don't really care about this. But in the future, I think going forward, that needs to change. It seems like tech leaders seem much more equipped to handle the coming challenges that we're going to be facing than most of our politicians. I'm sure you saw the Zuckerberg, whatever you want to call it, fiasco.
Yeah, well, look, I think there's some balance here. So first of all, I agree with your assertion that tech leaders are much better suited to architect the future than the vast majority of our elected officials. I agree with that statement. Having said that, I do think that a lot of the time what I've seen from Silicon Valley is a lack of understanding of the world outside Silicon Valley and a lack of understanding of the world outside of the technology industry. So I do think there's some give and take there, but I think they have to more aggressively engage in policymaking in Washington, in Brussels, in Tokyo, wherever policymaking is taking place. Because this whole libertarian view of, oh, I'm going to go build the future and government, and I don't have to worry about government. Well, that's just bullshit. Libertarians don't build roads or fight wars or, keep your food healthy, keep your skies clean. It doesn't work. And to just disengage from government is to cede the playing field to people far less capable than you and far less understanding than you of the forces shaping the future.
How could you take what Obama did in terms of connecting with people on a global and individual basis and teach that or train that to politicians or specifically tech leaders? I imagine if they were to meet Obama, they would think a little bit differently. I'm not saying he's the world's best president because I don't think he was, but I think in terms of he seems like a generally good human being. And I don't think you can say that about a lot of politicians.
Well, he is a genuinely good human being. Look, I don't know how you can train authenticity or, I think you can train people to communicate, but I think the most important thing is people need to understand that you've only got one mouth, but you've got two ears. And I think that a lot of the time when people think about how to connect, whether it's globally or in smaller settings, they're thinking about what they're going to say. And they forget that, the best way to inform what you say is to actually listen very carefully. And I find that a lot of people, rather than listening, are just waiting for their turn to talk. So that's where I would start with anything. I mean, the second thing is Obama did move. I think he is who he is in part because he moved between worlds. He moved between worlds that were white and black, between worlds that were urban and rural, between the very poor South Side of Chicago and the very wealthy world of Harvard-educated elites. So if I were going to give that if I were going to give advice to, whether it was people in the technology industry or, for that matter, people in Washington, I'd say if you want to understand how to connect with people outside of your circle, you need to spend time outside of your circle. And it's something that from the day he was born, Barack Obama did. And what we saw were remarkable natural gifts combined with, by the time he'd been elected president, 40 some years of moving between worlds.
And I think that's incredibly prescient for people because we're moving towards a world where all of us are in that same world. It's humanity seems to have forgotten that we're one freaking civilization. Do you think we ever get to that point of, let's say, do you think in the next 50, 100 years we have some type of global civilization where it's one people, one government versus kind of what we have today, which is lots of kids fighting over the scraps?
Yeah, no, look, I think that I don't think we're going to have homogenization of of culture and governance. If anything, we've seen, we saw during the 80s, 90s, and first decade of the 21st century, we saw some homogenization, and then over the last eight-ish years, we've seen a reassertion of certain kinds of nationalism and sort of pixelation. I think that there will be certain things that homogenize, but I don't see people allowing their identity. I don't imagine a global melting pot. And in fact, part of what I think people find most rewarding these days, for both good and bad, in a world that is more globally connected, that which is local and that which speaks to their own identity and heritage, I believe, grows more important.
That's pretty cyclical though. If you kind of look, it's always going up and down, and then 5 years from now, it's going to be exciting to have the, I don't know, coffee from Peru and the nice dresses from France, and it kind of goes
Yeah.
in and out in that sine wave type function.
I think so. I agree with that, which is why in 50 or 100 years, I don't see us going from 196 sovereign nation states to one, or a world with a few thousand identifiable cultures or microcultures to a handful of them. So it's the Sinewave design that I actually believe in that will have us alternating between sort of globalism and localism.
Do you think we'll have more or less governing type bodies, so countries, city states, etc., in 50 to 100 years than we have now?
That's a great question, because there are two things working against each other here, right? So big nation states are more and more difficult to govern, and where we see the real action in governance tends to be at the local level, at the municipal level, or at the state level. But by the same token, we see new forms of governance, for lack of a better word, coming from massive global platforms, the Amazons and Apples of the world, which in effect are setting terms of governance, whether it's economic governance or even with, terms of service governance, in terms of speech and other things. We see this dynamic that seems to be in conflict of things simultaneously getting bigger and smaller. So 50 to 100 years from now, I don't know if we're going to have more or fewer forms of governance.
Does it scare you, the power of the tech giants?
No, gosh, maybe I get part of the reason why I haven't been as scared as others is honestly because I know the leadership of the tech giants. And while they may fuck up periodically, I don't perceive malignant intent among any of them.
Leaders change.
Leaders do change. No, that's right. And the individual there's a difference between the individual and the institutional. And also, and this is just my own sort of position of super privilege, if I feel like something's totally screwed up inside one of the platforms, I historically have been able to email somebody there and it actually gets addressed. That was actually my job in many respects during the Obama administration, was to work with these big platforms. I also think that for all of the screw ups that take place there, the biggest of which recently has to be Facebook's role in the 2016 election. If you look at the big platforms, it's hard to argue that they haven't made our lives substantially better. I sure do like my iPhone and have benefited from it. I sure do like and have benefited from Google search. Amazon Prime has kept me from wasting God knows how many hours. Facebook, as pissed off as everybody is at Facebook right now, does make it easier than ever for me to connect with people all over the world. So, while I'm not going to put a halo over the heads of the platforms and their leaders, what I am going to say is that I think that they're taking a beating right now that's probably a little much.
I know for your book, you had a testimonial by Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Alphabet or Google or whichever it was at the time. How do you contrast the leaders in tech versus the leaders in politics?
It's a good question. First of all, the leaders in tech tend to be a lot more impressive than the leaders in politics. There are exceptions. Barack Obama's an exception. Here's what I would say is that they have different incentives. The leaders in tech tend not to be looking for, large scale public affirmation, and their incentives are within a small to maximize their prominence within a smaller community and to maximize wealth. Among politicians, the juice, what seems to really get a politician going, is public love. Somebody coming up to them at the burger joint and saying, "Hey, I voted for you." You can just see their eyes twinkle when when politicians are confronted that way. Whereas a tech CEO who's confronted by one of their users, you can see that they freak out. So for tech CEOs, the incentives are really to maximize standing within a smaller social circle and to maximize wealth. And for the politician, it's to maximize public standing and power.
So narcissism. So
Yeah.
in terms of politics, is it forever changed and broken post-Trump? We basically learned what we learned at the beginning of the internet. If you would say something outrageous, people would link to you and say, "God, this is a terrible person." And then you would rank number one and you would get all the traffic. That happened to a massively, ridiculously larger scale at this point because everyone got upset about Trump. Europeans were like, "God, well, look what's happening here." And I had friends, I was living in Europe, and they were all going and checking out these stories. And all that does is feed eyeballs, which push things up to the top of the news, which is kind of news and kind of stories.
Yep. Well, look, so is it irrevocably broken? No. There have been, other leaders in world history, two of whom I named, Mussolini and Hitler, who I believe are, vulgar, demented pig demons, a la Donald Trump, but we've recovered. And similarly, what I hope, not everybody recovered, just ask 6 million Jews in Germany. And I do think that there will be a substantial cost exerted on humanity and on America and Americans specifically by Donald Trump's presidency. But I can't help but think that we can recover from this.
See, that's not what I mean, though. When you learn the gamification strategies to always win,
Yep.
we can play tic-tac-toe, and if I know how to not lose, you will never win the game.
Right.
Once that cat is out of the bag, so to speak, is there a way to put the cat back? The next politician just has to not be an asshole, but also essentially scream at the top of their lungs. And they kind of figured out what works and what doesn't. It's extreme. That's what works on websites. That's what seems to work if you want to get elected.
Yeah, so certainly that's what is working now. Whether that is what's will be working in 2 or 3 or 5 or 8 years is to be determined, because I do think that there has to be a sort of lashing out against Trump, where even if somebody becomes incredibly well known, becoming incredibly well known does not necessarily translate into winning elections. So I think that there will be politicians who become incredibly well known, but who may end up losing.
So you don't think all publicity is good publicity?
Well, look, I don't. I do think it's good up to a certain point where, if you run for office and nobody knows who you are, you're not going to win. Um, and maybe this is me being naive, but I just can't help but think that, if the way in which you are becoming known uh, ultimately ultimately makes you look horrible, it's hard for me to imagine that that Trump-like strategy is always going to work. It worked once. It worked with Donald Trump. How systemic that is, I think, is TBD.
I think you could fix it if you required 100% voter turnout, but if you don't, you're just patterning to the most extreme. So extreme will have high turnout, and then no one wanted to come for Hillary because people hated her for XYZ reason.
Yeah, and I think that if you're going to take mandating voting out of this, just increasing the level of voter participation among people under 40. People under 40 didn't necessarily like Hillary Clinton, but they still voted for her. For people under 40, she still crushed Trump. So whether something's mandatory or not, you've got to, behaviors have to change so that, you know, decisions made by people over the age of 60 are not entirely deterministic for what's going to happen for absolutely everybody.
Especially not if they're going to be living longer. Let's talk tech and some of the interesting stuff that you saw while in and outside of the White House. What are you most excited about?
I'm most excited about the commercialization of genomics. Each of us have 20 to 25,000 genes in our body. And, for many years, ever since the mapping of the human genome, 20-ish years ago, we've imagined a day where we might be able to do precision medicines and diagnostics that are otherworldly relative to the medical practices of our youth. I think we're getting really close to that. I think that the ability to identify cancerous cells at 1/100th of what can be seen by an MRI by doing a simple genetic sample, it's not going to that doesn't cure cancer, but for many cancers it takes it from being an automatic killer to being something that is really treatable. I think that we were talking earlier in this conversation about how global life expectancy when I was born was 58. Today it's over 70. The way for global life expectancy to get into the 80s, I believe, is through the commercialization of genomics. And then from a wealth creation standpoint, I think it's going to be, internet-like in its impact. The world's last trillion-dollar industry was created out of computer code. The world's next trillion-dollar industry, I believe, is going to be created out of genetic code.
Probably even more. I mean, what's more valuable than living longer?
That's
What
exactly right.
billionaire wouldn't give everything if they didn't have kids, and then almost everything even if they did?
Well, and it's interesting. It's funny you should mention billionaires in this respect. The way that I first understood the power of genomics was, and forgive me this story, but I met this guy who I thought was a gym rat. I play racquetball, and there was this guy who big, scraggly gray beard was always there, and I came to understand that this guy, Bert Vogelstein, is actually a researcher at Johns Hopkins who led the team that figured out how mutations in proteins cause cancer back in the 1980s. And he's actually the world's most cited living scientist. Yeah, right? Kind of a big deal. And and I was talking to Dr. Vogelstein, and what he told me, he said he had this thing called a billionaire's test, where if you give him and his team a blood sample, and sequencing the genetic material within it, they could identify cancerous cells when people are substantially pre-symptomatic and don't feel even a little bit bad, and when obviously the cancers are much more treatable. When he told me this story, the cost of the test was $40,000. The year after that, it was $14,000. The year after that, it was a little more than $1,000. Now the same test, it's gone from being the billionaire's test, which you would get at the Mayo Clinic or Johns Hopkins, and you would only pay $40,000, out of your pocket, even though you're feeling great if you're really, really rich, to pretty soon it's going to be a part of all of our annual checkups and just picked up by insurance. And so, it's interesting to me to see how the costs of all of these things are going from the billionaires to the millionaires to hopefully soon to the masses.
Do you think the costs will go down fast enough? If you look at technology, that's how it has always worked up to this point. The rich essentially subsidize the production to reach scale so that you have cheaper unit costs so that everyone can afford it. With genetics, not so much with testing. Testing is one thing. And you can see even today, like the top 1% lives 10 years longer than the bottom 1% in the US. But in terms of legitimate genetic enhancements, it's going to be expensive initially.
Oh, it is.
Is this something where we could have a runaway type technology where those high costs lead to faster evolution in elites, probably politicians, because that what better way to be bribed than to live longer? Is that something that you're worried about in terms of disproportionate access to exponential health tech?
Yes. Look, I mean, the very simple fact of the matter is that the slope on the graph for elective enhancements for a long period of time is going to be out of reach for most Americans. So what that means is a very practical matter is you could have a generation, and a generation is a long time. If you have 15 years of one class of people benefiting from genomics and the vast majority of others are not, there's already natural selection taking place in and among elites. Imagine if suddenly they are biologically advantaged, you know, to a degree that is almost unimaginable today. I mean, you could see us literally building a class of elites at the genetic level, the likes of which are almost unimaginable today. And imagine the fallout from that.
I think the differentiator, the driving force will be one thing, and that is whether or not we're able to be as effective at delivering gene therapy to an individual who is alive versus in vitro or in vivo. Because if you do it essentially to the next generation, that means evolution takes at least one generation, which is still 10,000 times faster than it used to be, but it's a generation. But if you're able to do it on the person by person basis, that means that you can have multiple enhancements while you're alive, and then there's no lag. So
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and instead of a 10-year gap between people in the top 1% and people at the 50th percentile, we could suddenly see that being a 20-year, 25-year gap in terms of life expectancy. So it's a little bit scary. What's interesting is attempts to regulate this I could imagine attempts to regulate this in the United States. But I don't think it would work if for no other reason than I would imagine that the Switzerlands and the Singapores of the world, if there's a failure to offer something in the United States, or if that offering is overly regulated, then Switzerland or Singapore would love to be the home of people flying in first class or on their private jets to get their bodies hacked. So I do think that this is near inevitable. It's not near inevitable that it just happens in the United States.
oh, definitely, because even if the countries around the world tried to make it illegal, where there's a will, there's a way. It doesn't matter if it's illegal. If your kid's going to die and you're incredibly wealthy, well, fuck the law. I'm
Yep.
going to do what I need to do. And I think anyone would say that, regardless of who they are.
No, that's right. I do think the one thing that's going to slow this down the most is the way that we bring therapies to market. The old FDA model of we're going to spend a couple $1 billion to develop, it takes a couple $1 billion in many years to bring a pill to market. The way that genetic therapies work, it doesn't work that way. Highly individualized. The way to productize and commercialize in this world is very different than what the Mercks and Pfizers of the world have done for the past few decades. And I don't think that the U.S. government yet has figured out what its role as a regulator or enabler is in this world.
Yeah, I was just talking to Bertrand Mesco. He's a medical futurist. He's got a huge following, but he was talking about how DIYers are ahead of governments and corporations. If you've got diabetes and you need some type of solution, you can either kill yourself for the money, or you can get a DIY kit and grow your own pancreas, and it works, and it costs almost nothing. It's really interesting how it would be interesting to see if genetics and health became almost an open source movement.
That would be interesting. It's possible. It is possible. And, again, going back to an earlier part of our conversation where we discussed whether we were going to have, more or fewer forms of governance, where there is knowledge and where there are incentives, it's not difficult to me to imagine that if, the structures and strictures of national governments are not enabling people to live longer lives, that these open source transnational movements will enable it. If you're offering somebody a longer, a happier, a healthier life, nobody's going to sit around and wait for their country to catch up. And there are network effects and community effects where information sharing, knowledge sharing, and resource sharing, can benefit not just yourself, but a broader community. I could see this as something of an open source movement.
Do you think the religious and Christian background of the US will hold them back versus other countries that are more willing to do tests?
I think it already is. I mean, if you look at the decisions made during the George W. Bush's administration on stem cell research, I mean, it's precisely what we're talking about. So as I do think that there is a very regressive impulse in America that holds science back, that holds exploration back, and which is why a lot of the best lab work being done in the U.S. is often done pretty quietly and privately and outside of public view, because you don't want it scrutinized by the Baptist down the street, the Baptist preacher down the street who thinks that what you're doing is too godly and it's not meant to be done by man. I do think that there is something in our culture that does not lend itself to the most expeditionary work in science and medicine.
Will that be the downfall of the US as a superpower?
I don't think so, just because despite that impulse, despite that aspect of our culture, it is actually not dominant among elites. And what do elites do? Elites fund the Johns Hopkinses and the Mass Generals, and so we have a culture that cuts against it in one respect, but on the other hand, we have access to capital, and we have immigration policies that have enabled the world's best researchers to come here and do their work. So things working at cross currents a little bit.
Do you think that immigration policy will continue? It seems tenuous, to say the least.
Well, we've already taken steps backwards. It's all too often the case now in the U.S. that people will come here, they'll get their masters at Stanford, or their PhD from MIT or anywhere else, and then having gotten a world-class education, we make people go home. It's like literally the stupidest thing we could possibly do, and it happens with too great a frequency. When I worked at the State Department, we worked very, very hard with the White House to try to get Congress to pass immigration reform so that we would continue to be the destination for the world's greatest talent, as well, frankly, as the world's people who are most in need. And we've absolutely seen steps backwards in the last couple of years. And ask any tech company CEO and they will tell you that the lack of access to talent is jamming them up.
I think Canada is going to probably take the lead on this. They're so far ahead in the way they think about things. Obviously, there's other larger countries that do a good job, but at least if you think about North America, Canada does a great job with immigration, does a great job with education, does a great job with social support, does a great job with universal health care. And generally speaking, we lived there for 6 months, and the way I described it to people is like Canada's like the US, but without a lot of the bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, I got to tell you, if the weather were better,
Yeah, we would be there as well, family
it,
and
it,
weather.
it would be a different story. And that may sound glib. I actually mean it literally. If Toronto, make Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, 600 miles to the south of where they are right now, and you've got a totally different story.
Yeah, Toronto's like a little friendly New York City.
It's
So
fascinating.
So your background is innovation and technology. You wrote an awesome book, at least that's what I've heard. Industries of the Future. And I'm curious to think or to see where you think we're headed in terms of technologies, industries, jobs, work, automation.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, thanks for mentioning the book. It's being published it's going to be up to 24 languages by the end of this year. I mean, look, the short version of it is I don't think the future is Star Trek. We aren't all going to live to be 150 years old, happy, healthy, wealthy, lacking for nothing. But it also isn't Mad Max. Look, the changes that are going to come are of net benefit to society. But the transition is tough for, those segments of our society that, are wearing red hats that say make America great again. They want to go back to the America of the 1950s where, dad got home from his union job at 5:15, dinner was on the table at 6, mom didn't work, he was at the bowling league at 7:30. Look, that is an America of the past that doesn't want to embrace the America of tomorrow. Um, so for all of the optimism I have about our living longer, happier, healthier, more productive lives with less bullshit, a lot of what's being built right now is taking friction out of our lives, taking meaningless, time-wasting processes and turning them on to and eliminating them with taps on our phone. Um, there will be some, and there will be a loud, potent segment of society that sort of takes us screaming into the future.
I think it's a dangerous paradigm to think about the past or the future as better. So what you'll see is a lot of what people are doing these days online technologically isn't necessarily making them happier. We're more depressed than ever. That's thanks to Facebook and marketing for pharmaceuticals and poor nutrition and a bunch of other things. But you see people having less of a purpose. I don't know if you've read, I think it's called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Manufacturing or something. It's
Mhm.
basically kind of if you think about the Japanese way of doing things, but doing it perfectly. How do we create that balance so that we don't create people that are plugged in and miserable, and we don't create coal farmers that are killing over from lung cancer?
Yeah, look, I think we have to self-regulate. I mean, it's interesting. My most successful friends, in material terms, my friends with hundreds of millions of dollars who made their hundreds of millions of dollars, oftentimes by getting people addicted to the piece of technology that they created. They are the strictest when it comes to their use and their children's use of technology. You go to the $60,000 a year private schools in Silicon Valley, and there's a heck of a lot less technology um, than there is in many of the public schools. And so I do think that it may sound ridiculous, but regulating your use of technology and more importantly, regulating your kids' use of technology is difficult but important. My wife and I have three kids, 16, 13, and 11 years old. And the jihad that is waged at our house is between the parents and the kids on how much screen time they're going to have. But I do think it matters, whether our 13-year-old daughter is seeking happiness um, through the form of likes on Instagram, or whether she's achieving happiness by being out in the world with her friends, with her phones put away, is directly a byproduct of what, the parents are going to insist on, and the norms and habits that are established. So I think it's a really important moment for parenting.
Is it fair to say that the past was more dominated by intrinsic motivation and the future technology is more dominated by extrinsic?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I mean, look, when I was growing up in West Virginia, and I'd wake up in the morning and run out my back door, which went right into the woods, and I'd spend all day playing with my friends, and we did not emit or receive a single piece of data. When we were out there, we had zero digital footprint in the hills of West Virginia. Yeah, I think that this was a life in a world where meaning was defined more from within and from a smaller community, rather than the life that my kids are living right now. And again, I don't think that they should trade their lives for the life that I spent in the hills of West Virginia. But it's simply to say that what I want to do is maximize the positive and minimize the negative of their living in such a digital world.
And that right there is both sides, both perspectives. That right there is what most people aren't able to have. And it's the reason we have these stupidly angry conversations where people hate each other afterwards. I
That's
got
right.
I got a couple more questions for you just because you're a really interesting guy, Alec. What are you most worried about? Is there a technology that scares you more than most?
Wow, that's a great question. Is there a technology that scares me the most? Um, you know, the technology that scares me the most might actually be the weaponization of social media. When I was working for President Obama, we saw technology used to, remarkable political effect with the Green Movement in Tehran, with the revolutions in the Arab world and what have you. And since then, we've seen the weaponization of social media, with things like Donald Trump's presidential campaign. Things aren't getting better, or they aren't better yet. And so it's hard for me to think past this current challenge of how do we take Twitter and Facebook and their equivalents around the world, and to bend them back in the direction of being positive and productive, and less really pointed, really sharp political weapons. It's hard for me to get over that right now.
There's a quote I really like, and I'm not sure who says it, but I've heard it from Dan Carlin. It's quantity has a quality all its own.
Mhm.
And I think that that's very applicable here. Something that is good in moderation with X number of people online and connected. As it becomes larger and larger, there's a reason why when we have riots, mob mentality has essentially no insight. It's stupider than every person there, and yet terrible things happen. It's the reason why ants can organize and create something in a swarm. Is
That's
that
right.
what we're seeing here?
I think it is. I mean, if you look at the Trump movement, I think there's an analogy there. I mean, there is nothing in history that reminds me so much of this Trump movement, enabled substantially by social media, as the rise of fascism and Nazism, pre-World War II. The way that social media can be used to develop very powerful anti-Semitic, racist or nationalist narratives, convince huge numbers of people of what's behind them. It's really powerful and distressing.
If your kids came to you tomorrow and asked, Dad, what should I do? What should I study? Or should I even study? What would you tell them? Both for you and then if you were going to tell someone who wasn't quite in the same position as you.
Yeah, so I'm all about interdisciplinary learning. It's I think that there you need to understand things that are technical. I think that computer code is the alphabet that much of the future is going to be written in. But I think that if you don't want to just be a working class, middle class coder, um, then your technical skills are combined with aptitudes that we associate with in the humanities, whether that's communications abilities, emotional intelligence, and understanding of behavioral psychology. So this is a non-theoretical for me. My kids are in school right now, and for my 16-year-old and 13-year-old, these are questions that we discuss. And for us, for me and my wife, it's really about the mashups. My son is a really smart kid. He's got his mom's brains, and he's taking AP physics and he's taking AP calculus and all this stuff. But we make sure he's also taking art history, and he's also studying Chinese. And I think that kind of balance is really important in our kids' educations.
Studying Chinese, it's so valuable, and that's such a DC thing to do. I got I got two last questions for you, and that's today, what's the thing that's coming up? Either it can be recently past or coming up in the future soon. What are you most excited about? What gets you wired?
What am I most excited about? I'll give one concrete example. I'm excited about the application of data analytics to real world problems. So, I've been paying attention lately to, the effect of the wildfires in California. And there's a terrific company that I'm involved with called One Concern. And the products that they are developing to help mitigate risk and to help understand, what can be done to contain wildfires, minimize the effects of earthquakes, and things like this. It's data analytics applied to real world problems. So that gets me very excited.
Data and information is power. It's crazy where we're headed with that. I thought this was the last question, but there was one I forgot to ask.
All right.
Were you with Hillary there that night?
With the night she lost?
Yeah.
No, I was not. And I'm certainly glad that I wasn't. That election felt cursed from the beginning. It really did. There was sort of bad mojo. I was not as involved in her campaign as I was in Obama's first presidential campaign. And it strikes me, I was involved in day one from Obama's campaign, that it had sort of a magical feel. And, we all worked our guts out. We loved it. We felt like we were going to win. And from the very beginning of Hillary's campaign, it felt like a death march. We were supposed to win. It was negative. It was angry. It was, there was bad mojo. And it just contrasted very, very starkly with my one other experience in presidential campaign, which was Obama's first one.
It felt like gravity. You could see it coming.
Oh, and and there were times like the grab them by the pussy tapes. I was just kind of like, all right, well, it's October. He's now said something so totally disqualifying. It's unimaginable. It's literally unimaginable that he could win. And yet it's still like, it was joyless. And she did, and the campaign still did manage to lose. It was unfreaking believable. And that contrasted with the Obama campaign, where I thought the hurdles were much, 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 much higher. And we just sort of leapt over them.
It's reality TV, baby.
Yeah.
That's one thing actually I noticed with the Democrats is they don't ever play offense and talk about what they're doing. It's always attacking, which isn't necessarily the best bet, but
and I think that whomever the Democrats nominate in 2020, the platform can't just be anti-Trump. You can't just say who and what you're against. There has to be an affirmative vision for what you want to do.
Yes, the enemy of my enemy is not enough in this case.
No, it's not.
Last question for you, Alec. I know you're a busy guy. If you had to leave people with one thing, a quote, a call to action, what would it be and why?
So I would say it's to make mistakes of commission rather than omission. I mean, the one quote that is most inspirational to me was said over 100 years ago by Teddy Roosevelt. And he said, "It's far better to dare mighty deeds, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they dwell in a gray twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat." And so for me, my advice to people is enjoy much and suffer much. Have big wins and big losses. Both, that life is better than a life in the gray twilight where you know neither victory nor defeat.
I like that quote, and you sound a lot less pretentious than Teddy. Then again, I guess he was in the position to be pretentious. Where's the best place for people to find you, Alec? Check out this book I've been hearing about. You've got
Well,
like 300 reviews on Amazon.
well, I appreciate it. Look, alecross.com, AlecRoss.com.
If you guys have enjoyed this, check this out. Alec's a pretty interesting guy. He can't tell you he may actually be a spy. We can neither confirm nor deny the report, but we've heard some interesting stories. Thanks for coming on, Alec.
Look, thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. Disruptors.fm. If you enjoyed this, share it with a friend. Help us reach more folks so that we can get more awesome guests like Alex. Cheers. Awesome. That was good.